We're going to talk about absolute value equations, but before we can even talk about absolute value equations, we need to talk about what absolute value means. Well, absolute value, if you remember, let's think about what two values can have an absolute value of 5. Now remember those two lines? Those lines mean absolute value. And if you remember, absolute value of 5 is 5, but the absolute value of negative 5 is still 5 because absolute value is the distance from 0. Absolute value is a distance, and a distance cannot be negative. It's the distance from 0. So 5 is 5 steps from 0. And negative 5 is also 5 steps from 0. It just happens to be in another direction, but it's still 5 steps. I want you to grab hold of this part because you need to understand, I can't go negative 2 miles. I can drive 2 miles in one direction or another, but I can't go negative 2 miles. I can't go negative 2 minutes. Absolute value is all about those things that can't have negatives. So let's remember, what do we need to remember? Absolute value is a distance, and a distance is always positive. It cannot be negative. So how does that affect what we're discussing? Well, there were two values, weren't there? There were two values that could give you the same answer. The absolute value of 5 gave me an answer of 5, and the absolute value of negative 5 gave me an answer of 5. So we are now dealing with things that have more than one possible answer. Welcome to Algebra 2. All right, so how does this affect us? Well, let's look at this equation. Absolute value of x plus 1 equals 1. If you think about this discussion that we just had, what can be inside those two lines? Because there's actually two things that could be inside those lines and it would be okay. I can have a 1 in there. Absolute value of 1 is equal to 1. I could also have a negative 1 in there and I would still get the same answer as before. So I have two possible answers that could give me this idea, right? All right, so what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to have to make two equations because we have two answers. Now, one of ours was positive and one of them was negative. So we're going to need to make two equations, one positive and one negative. Well, here's our positive ones, and that's okay. It looks just like the one that we already have, x plus 1 equals 1. The other equation is the opposite, isn't it? It's the negative. So see that little negative right there? We're going to put a negative. X plus 1 equals 1. Now we have made the positive and we have made the negative. Oh, okay. So we have now two equations because we know we need two answers. So now let's isolate x, meaning we are just going to solve like we normally do. On this red side over here, all we're going to do is move the 1. If it was a positive 1, it's going to be a negative 1, and x is going to equal 0. But over here, didn't quite work out as well, did it? All right, we had a negative outside of parentheses. What does that mean? Well, I have to distribute that negative. It's a little like having a negative 1. So when I distribute that negative, it's negative times x is negative x, and negative times 1 is negative 1. So now we have this equation. Well, since this is negative 1, I'm going to add 1 to both sides, and I end up with negative x equals 2. Am I allowed to leave it negative x? No. I'm going to need to divide by negative 1 so that my x is positive. So now x equals negative 2. So now I have my two answers. And if you think about it, if you put 0 up here, if I put a 0 right here, 0 plus 1 is 1, and the absolute value of 1 is 1. Oh, good. Let's take negative 2. If I put negative 2 right there, negative 2 plus 1 is negative 1, And the absolute value of -1 is 1. Oh, good. We did good. All right. So now how do we tell people these are the answers? This is set builder notation. And you know it's set builder because of the little squiggly S looking things. And this is read x such that x can be 0 or -2. It can be either of those. A set such that x is equal to 0 or -2. And we need to learn how to say that. All right, let's try another one. What can be in here that would make this work? I thought we said that it could never be negative. Well, if absolute value is a distance and distance is always positive, then there's nothing that will work. Nothing will work. So we have to tell people, hello, broken, nothing will work. And this is how we're going to do it. This is not a 0. This is a null set, meaning there are no answers. Again, welcome to Algebra 2, because sometimes we're going to have more than one answer, and sometimes we're going to have to say, nope, there are no answers. This is not a 0. All right, so let's try one that will work. Now let's think about it again. What could go in there? Oh yeah, -5 or 5 could go in there. So there's a negative and a positive. So let's write some equations. Here's my first equation. X minus 1 equals 5. That looks just like the other one. But the other one has to be opposite, negative x minus 1. This one has to be positive. This one has to be negative. And now I just solve, okay? Now I did have to distribute right here, didn't I? Negative times x, negative x. A negative times a negative is a positive. All right, now I'm going to finish solving. But when I get right here and I get a negative x, I can't leave it that way. I have to divide by -1, and now I have my two answers. Set builder notation, x such that x can be 6 or -4, because we know there's more than one answer. All right, let's make it a little bit harder. The one thing that has to happen for me to do this, for me to write my two opposite equations, is for me to get my function alone. And if you look at my function, and my function is absolute value, which means it's this thing right here in the yellow box, this is my function. Look here. There's something hanging onto the edge of it, isn't it? There's a +3 right there. Well, I need to move him. I need to move him to the other side. How do I do that? Well, if it's adding 3, the reverse is subtracting 3. So now I have absolute value of x plus 1 equals 7. Now what do I do with that? Oh yeah, I have to have a positive. I have to have a negative. Let me think. All right, I'm ready to write my equations. X plus 1 equals 7. There's my positive equation. Negative x plus 1. That's my negative equation. And now I'm going to solve. At some point, you're going to think, oh, if I get one answer, it'll be 6. Then the other one must be -6. Did that work out on this one? No, not so much. So don't fall into that trap. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, well, if I find one of them, the other one has to be just the negative. Okay? Now, again, where's my function? My function is the absolute value. That's my function. Now, I need to get this 3 to go away. I need to get it to the other side. But that's not 3 plus absolute value. That is 3 times. In algebra, when things are together, when they're stuck together like that, that is multiplication, not addition. You would see a plus sign or a minus sign, but you don't see that, do you? So to reverse out multiplication, to go backwards with multiplication, I need to divide. So let's divide both sides by 3. And these 3's canceled out. And 9 divided by 3 is 3. And here I am. I'm right back to having my function alone. What am I going to do? Negative and positive. I'm going to write my negative equations and my positive equations, right? Positive, negative. And then I'm going to solve. Now, when I get negative x equals 4, am I done? No, I need to divide by negative 1. Oh, my little line went too far, didn't it? And I get x equals negative 4. Now, occasionally, someone will distribute. They will say 3 times x is 3x and 3 times 1 is 3. And they'll work it all out and they'll get something that comes like this and it looks like this and it gets them the same answer. But it doesn't always work. You cannot distribute into a function, and it's a rule that you need to know now. You cannot, just because it works for one time in one kind of thing, does not mean you can do it any other time. So let's stop right now. This is no good. It doesn't matter. Don't do it. All right? Okay. What do we need to remember? 2. We need to remember there are 2 answers, so we need to remember there are 2 equations. 2. We must remember there are 2 equations. Write an equation that is the same, the positive. Write an equation that is the opposite, the negative. How many answers are you going to have? You have 2 possible answers. That's absolute value equations, just the basics.